Hello everyone, welcome back to Words Worth Knowing. We're down to the last few words of Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, first to the Jew. And these are the words of that very proud Jew, Paul, who understood what was happening with the foundations of the Christian church. The roots of anti-Semitism are right there in the anti-Judaic kind of sentiments that were around. And since then, we've had a couple of thousand years of conflict because of the tremendous misunderstanding of the role of the Jew, that God went to the Jews first, that they are his chosen people. And so the misunderstandings and the misrepresentations of Judaism have always been problematic in the church. The Jewish people that we see today are not the Jewish people of the Old Testament. The Jewish people of the Old Testament were thoroughly dispersed, and the people we see today have completely different practices and understandings of faith, and that reinterpretation of their faith is largely due to a man called Maimonides, who was in Spain in about the 11th or 12th century, and he reinterpreted Jewish practice because there was no land and there was no temple. There was no possibility of offering sacrifices. And you all know that psalm that says, how can we sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land? And so the Jewish people had to reinvent themselves, and particularly in the reinterpretation of the meaning of Torah, to be the way in which one should walk. It's been thought of entirely as law previously, and we still refer to it as the Mosaic Law. Those first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which, except for the last few verses of Deuteronomy, are all attributed to Moses. So the religion of the ancient Old Testament people of God was quite different to what we see today. And we tend to stereotype, and we tend to take rather derogatory language from the New Testament, even the word Pharisee, and use it in such a way that doesn't really honour what God did with the Jews, through the Jews, and for us through our relationship with their scripture. So the Jewish people are the people of the book. And Paul writes in Romans 3, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. So the words of God that we love, all of those beautiful Psalms and the Proverbs and the history books, everything that we are so invested in was preserved for us by the Jewish people. And no wonder Paul says, I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if there was ever one. I was a Pharisee. The long history of preserving the scriptures was a great work that the Jews performed, and they did it systematically. They did it so that the scriptures themselves, the actual scrolls, would never be venerated. They would never take the place of God, but the words would be transcribed and transmitted without error. And we know the reliability of their system because of the 1,000-year gap between some of the scrolls and the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were recovered, and the very few errors that are to be found in that transmission. So this was a great work. Being people of the book was a wonderful thing because they had a clear revelation, a historical revelation of their own religion. And for Christianity, that's problematic because we always had that. In Romans 9, Paul says about the people of Israel, theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. It is not as though God's word had failed. And the great commentator F.B. Meyer says, the Hebrew nation was marvelously privileged by adoption as God's firstborn, by having the Shekinah glory, and by being called to maintain the witness of the temple and its services. This This was intended that humanity itself should benefit. It was intended for us. So the privileges that were pertain to the Jewish people were for our benefit, which is a wondrous thing. The difficulty, of course, is that the Christian church didn't respond as it should have responded to the Jewish people. Our role really was not to cut off their heads or convert them at the point of the sword, but to draw them into a loving relationship with Christ. The tragedy is that the Crusaders set out to reclaim the city of Jerusalem. That was on the basis of some peculiar understanding that was preached by someone called Peter the Hermit. There were many strange preachers. Most of these people that set out to get Jerusalem back from the Muslims at that stage didn't have any clear understanding of what the scriptures said about Christ. So on their way to defeat the Muslims, they stopped by in France, went along the Rhine, killing Jews instead. Medieval Christians depended on priests who were poorly educated, and the people that had the education, the monks, were monastic. They were sort of locked up or sitting in trees or whatever they might have been choosing to do to remain pure and untainted by the world. And so their reclusiveness was like a reflection of the reclusiveness of past populations of Jews who had the education and didn't share that knowledge with others, as was in medieval times. Easter was the most dangerous season for Jews because of the entrenched belief that the Jews had killed Christ. No understanding that Christ laid down his own life. And in some churches there was a liturgy that included reproaches, cursing the Jews for the death of Christ. This completely ignored the role of the Romans and completely ignored God's agenda in the death of Christ. And all of this came through lack of access to the scriptures. We tend to equate anti-Semitism with Kristallnacht, the rise of the Nazis. In 1938, they went through destroying shops, synagogues, and burning thousands of books. You have to burn the books if you want murder and mayhem, because it's best to keep people ignorant. The Jews were excluded by the Nazis from their jobs. They couldn't work as public servants. Thousands of Jewish doctors were sent off to concentration camps. One of the worst strategies by the Nazis was that they expelled the academics from the universities, which included many great scientific minds, and those scientists were quickly recruited to America and to England, where they worked in laboratories developing basically the science of warfare, which would eventually defeat Hitler. But Hitler himself didn't have any theology. He didn't have any personal axe to grind against the Jewish people. They were his scapegoat, because every cause needs a scapegoat. And there was 2,000 years of history of Jewish persecution. It had been relentless in every nation virtually throughout the world. The Jews had been persecuted. And so they were a popular scapegoat to the cause. In 1965, in recognition of the appalling suffering that occurred largely through the Second World War and the Holocaust, the Roman Catholic Church promulgated something called the Nostra Aetate, which was intended to be a modern pronouncement of how the religions should work together and respect one another. The unfortunate thing is that Christians are not really good at working together, and so sometimes the initiatives of other denominations and other movements are not quite to our taste. And so we're afraid of compromise as well. We think if we work with other Christian denominations, we'll be compromised. And then, of course, if we're interested in working with Jews or Muslims, it seems like a catastrophic compromise. Part of this comes because of our own lack of biblical literacy, not fully understanding that God's agenda is not complete. He hasn't completely finished his work with the Jews, and certainly he hasn't finished his work with the church. It's not all sewn up. In the book of Hebrews, we have the patriarchs. The separation between the Old and New Testament that we like to preserve is actually disrupted by the fact that the patriarchs appear here in the book of Hebrews, and they appear in such a way that we understand their place in an agenda that was not simply about their land. So many of the Jews of the Old Testament, their whole focus was on their land. When we read the Old Testament, what we see is the shadows of Christ, but what they saw was the promise of land. And so there was this desire for the land, for the restoration of the land, and there's always this sense of being disrupted, thrown out, drawn back to the land. But it says of Abraham, he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He was looking for something more. And so he had many precious promises from God. And Hebrews 11, of course, is about that cavalcade of heroes of faith. And who are these heroes of faith? Patriarchs. They are the characters of the Old Testament. Moses, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. So here we have Moses, who was believing God's promises, who was exercising faith, who had an understanding of the Christ. And when we read this, we'll say, oh yes, well the Jews should have known because there was Christ in the Old Testament. But for many of the Jewish readers of the Old Testament, or the hearers of it, there was the land, and that was their promise. But Abraham and Moses were looking ahead to a greater reward. In Hebrews 11:13 it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. The Jews today are not the Jews of the Old Testament, but many of those Jews are still earnestly seeking to please God. They're still looking to do the things that they believe their religion teaches them to do to have a right relationship with God. And the Bible tells us that God is a rewarder of those who earnestly seek him. So what does this actually mean for the Jews? And what does it mean for us? In Ephesians 2, we're reminded of who we were. Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles, remember at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope, without God in the world. We were the outsiders. We were the ones that didn't belong. We were the ones that didn't have the promise, the hope, and the future. But God had laid foundations, and those foundations were Jewish foundations. And God hasn't entirely finished with the Jewish people. For many people, when they want an understanding of God's purpose for the Jews, they go to the book of Revelation and the revelation to John on the island of Patmos. Or they go to the book of Ezekiel, which is also apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is written in a particular way, in the same way that you can't really use Shakespeare to understand theology or Chaucer to understand history. We really can't understand apocalyptic literature in a hard, literal way. We can't use it as a timeline or a plot for what God's going to do. But in Romans 9:6, we do have a clear statement from Paul. He says, clearly God has not failed to fulfill his promises to Israel, for that will never happen. But not everyone who has descended from Israel belongs to Israel. And so this reminds us that the promise is key, the promise is central, and entering into the promise through faith is what gives us that eternal hope in God. I'm going to leave you with this thought and hope that you go to the scriptures and search for yourself what it says about God's purpose for the Jewish people.